When Missouri voted on the slavery issue in 1861, the large majority said North, but those who wanted South refused to accept the result of the vote, and the war between the states began right then in St. Louis, with street fighting and homes burned down by pro-slavery mobs. And in the actual war, the third largest number of battles would be fought in Missouri. Kansas suffered more from an outbreak of violence in the streets because there was generally less law and order on the prairie, while farther west, when things got out of hand, they would just pin a badge on the fastest gun and call him sheriff. But sometimes the wrong person would be chosen for the job, and that was how circuit court riders came to be, dispensing federal justice to local courtrooms such as that of Judge Roy Bean. When Fremont lost the election, John C. Breckinridge became Buchanan's vice president, and Breckinridge would try for the presidency the following term since he was so popular in the South. But Abraham Lincoln was nominated instead, and Breckinridge came in third, while the man who had been slated for Fremont's vice president became the minister to France. After that election, any discussion about the institution of slavery failed entirely, because the matter could only be settled by force of arms. German Americans would turn the war between the states in favor of the North because they were anti-slavery, and Germans across the river from St. Louis had almost established a new Germany, but it didn't succeed because they thought of themselves as primarily Americans. St. Louis would be the pivotal town in controlling traffic on the Mississippi, and Fremont got along great with Germans, while slave owners called the Germans peasant-minded for insisting on working their own farms. The 12th Missouri Regiment spoke only German, and 100 of them chased 2,000 Confederates out of Missouri while using only sabers, even though 1/3 of them died trying. Fremont promoted many Germans into the ranks of officers and promised to pay them with his own money, and Union officers like Fremont and Benjamin Butler put fugitive slaves to work for the Union cause, but Southern spies would have them sent back behind Southern lines. In the West, the Union forces, commanded by John C. Fremont, built up a strong base at Cairo, Illinois, at the junction of the Ohio and the Mississippi, where 39-year-old Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant was placed in charge. But then Fremont upset Lincoln's delicate political strategy by issuing a proclamation freeing the slaves in the area of his command. And since Fremont was neither particularly competent nor particularly interested in getting on with the war anyway, the president fired him. The Last Best Hope, A History of the United States, Part 2, 1815 to 1900, by Forrest McDonald, Leslie E. Decker, and Thomas B. Govan, Addison Wesley Publishing Company, 1972, page 521. The first Union general to die in the war had been expecting Fremont to send him reinforcements, which never came, and that general had graduated from West Point and despised Fremont for having been courts-martialed and for surrounding himself with foreigners. Fremont's campaign literature had been translated into German, and they'd held torchlight parades for him, and many seasoned soldiers from Europe had eagerly come to fight in the war under Fremont's command, while the army tore down his house in California and built Fort Mason. Despite the treachery among his own Union compatriots, Fremont managed success by buying guns from overseas on credit, although that may have been a cover story for his having paid with Breckinridge's gold. And when Fremont went to Germany in 1863 to purchase arms, he joined the Berlin Geographical Society and was given a gold medal by the King of Prussia, the Cross of the Order of Merit, while Heinrich Schliemann was digging up ancient Troy. People thought Fremont was as important as Washington and Columbus, and some thought he could have ended the Civil War immediately with his plan to go down the Mississippi, capture New Orleans and continue up the East Coast seizing ports, since that battle plan had worked in California, and Fremont was not afraid to try, having seen plenty of combat with the Bear Flaggers against the Mexican army. Fremont certainly had more experience than anyone at moving groups of armed men and equipment around, and he had come under fire several times in California on his own ranch, and Fremont could have become president if only he'd been willing to defend slavery. It was said that Fremont's campaign had made it possible for Abraham Lincoln to become president 4 years later, and 2 days after the election in 1856, the courts handed down the Dred Scott verdict, which had been no surprise because 5 of the justices were from the South. A slave named Dred Scott had sued for freedom in 1846, and over 10 years later, in 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court called Dred Scott an animal rather than a free man, and in their decision, they quoted laws pertaining to property rights formerly handed down by the English nobility. Meantime, the radical Republicans, steadily augmented in numbers as the war wore on, pressed insistently for complete and thoroughgoing emancipation. 2 of Lincoln's generals, John C. Fremont and David Hunter, early yielded to this pressure, the first with a proclamation issued in August 1861, which freed the slaves of disloyal citizens in Missouri, and the second with a proclamation issued in May 1862, which performed a like service for all the slaves in North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Both orders were revoked by the president, who understood far better than his subordinates the opposition within the North that such a course was sure to arouse. Lincoln would have much preferred a system of graduated emancipation with compensation to the owners of slaves. In April 1862, Congress adopted such a policy for the District of Columbia, and at Lincoln's suggestion also offered federal lands to the loyal slave states, which were not accepted, to aid them in working out a similar policy. The Federal Union, A History of the United States, to 1865, by John D. Hicks, Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Riverside Press, Houghton Mifflin Company, 1937-1948, page 680 to 81. Lincoln's freeing of the slaves happened on the first day of 1863, and he did so because if he proclaimed to the world that the war was being fought to free the slaves, there would be an immediate end to the danger of foreign intervention. His mind made up, he waited 2 full months longer before he acted, so that the winning of a Union victory, Antietam, September 17, 1862, could be cited as proof that his course was not a choice of desperation. Then on September 22, 1862, he issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, the Federal Union, page 681. England's desire to colonize the South had been contingent upon retaining the institution of slavery, and there would be no point in gaining the cotton fields without the established unpaid labor. And even after 600,000 people had died in the war between the states, there would be no real help from the North given to the former slaves, because the war had not been about freeing the slaves, but about ending the rebellion, and very little would change for Americans of African descent after the South surrendered. In 1866, there was a race riot in New Orleans where 200 former slaves died, and another in Memphis where 50 were killed, and Congress wanted to make racial discrimination a crime, but hostility in the Democrat South was so murderous that they could only compromise by allowing some restrictive black codes until Americans of African origin became prosperous enough to stick up for themselves. This, then, had been the philosophy of Lincoln, that the legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people what they need to have done, but cannot at all do, or cannot so well do, for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. In all that the people can individually do as well for themselves, government ought not to interfere. Abraham Lincoln, a new portrait, edited by Henry B. Kranz, New York, G. P. Putnam's Sons, 1959, page 64. The new laws were just like the old laws, with the word Negro written instead of slave, and the federal military was incapable of stopping marauding vigilantes committing murders in the dead of the night, often carried out with the assistance of the mayor or the chief of police, and there were not enough northern troops left in the South to maintain order, and the locals had a friend in the White House. Johnson thought that Southern congressmen should be allowed back into Congress as though nothing had happened after the war between the states, and Johnson wanted to use his presidential pardoning power to make everything the way it had been before the war, while some in Congress said that the South shouldn't even be allowed to have states anymore, and not even have the same rights as a territory. When Congress assembled on December 4, 1865, senators and representatives from the Southern states, most of whom had been leaders in the Confederacy, were waiting outside the doors to take their seats in the national legislature. Rise of the American Nation by Lewis Paul Todd, New York, Harcourt Brace Jovanovich, 1972, page 407. Congress immediately took up a constitutional amendment that in future anyone who took an oath of public office, received a salary, and then took up arms against the government would not be allowed to stay in office after the smoke cleared if their side lost. This 14th Amendment also told the South that the U.S. government would not pay them back what it had cost them to lose the war, and also that the U.S. government would not pay them for lost slaves. President Johnson told the Southern states not to pass the amendment, so it had to wait until the next election to pass, after all the Confederates had been voted out of office. The North thought it better for free Americans of African descent to have the benefit of living in legitimate states, but Johnson opposed the Northerners, so the South ended up with martial law instead that made everybody unhappy and ate up a lot of tax dollars. Military rule would last until the 14th Amendment passed, and it would take an additional 2 years to get Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia back into the Union.